Hello, everybody. My name is Nate Warfield. Thank you for having me at Disclosure Conference. And today I'm going to be talking about hunting CVE 2020-5902. So a little bit about me first. I'm actually the founder number 2 of the CTI League, which is a pro bono group of InfoSec professionals who's been spending a lot of our free time during this COVID pandemic trying to defend hospital networks from malicious hackers and evil actors. I myself have been a hacker for about a little over 25 years. I was a network engineer for about 18 of those years, including 10 years that I spent working for F5 Networks, which means I have an interesting history of knowledge around this product and this vulnerability. I do network security research in my spare time, and I used to do a lot of traveling to speak at conferences, which I very much miss. Thank you, COVID. And if you like the social media stuff, I have my Twitter handle and my GitHub are there, where I store some of the queries and tooling that I use to do this kind of hunting. And yes, this picture here, I used to be a drum and bass DJ in earlier years, and I promised that I had a beard when COVID started. So all of this is not grown from that picture. So what exactly is an F5 device, right? So these are load balancers. They do SSL VPN. Some people call them application delivery controllers, web application firewalls. They do DNS load balancing and geographic DNS load balancing. And they can also do deep packet inspection. TLDR, these are very big, expensive network devices, which run in most of the Fortune 500. When I left F5 a bunch of years ago, they had somewhere around 30,000 customers. How expensive? These things are in range from $30,000 to $750,000 a piece. And people buy them in pairs because they're load balancers, so they have a failover, sort of like a HSRP in routing world. The market cap of the company is around $9 billion, which interestingly enough is only half of what Citrix's market cap is. So they run CentOS Linux, and we're going to get into the internals here in a minute. But what they do is they run CentOS Linux for their management infrastructure, and then Apache Tomcat is what runs their GUI. They've had a few nasty vulnerabilities in the management plane of their devices over the years. IOActive found some buffer overflows in a Java module a bunch of years back. And then someone else found a reused root SSH key back in, I think, 2012. And those are not the ones we're talking about today. We're talking about the worst one. So why is one of these devices a high-value target? So these are very expensive, obviously, and they sit in the core of the network. They have access to everything, right? It's your load balancer, it's your SSL VPN endpoint. These things are generally going to have access to all of the internal infrastructure once you're on the device itself. They're also rarely upgraded. These things are mission-critical devices, and F5 has had some code quality issues over the year, which means that most people who manage these things try to avoid touching the operating system and the code unless they absolutely have to. They do SSL and TLS offloading, so if you can get on one of these devices, you can find SSL certs, keys. Everything is actually on the device itself. They do sell them with hardware security modules or HSMs, but those are, when I worked there at least, there was very few people that actually bought that extra module because it was extremely expensive. So if they've also can do third-party authentication, so they can authenticate against your LDAP, your Active Directory, TACACS, and Radius. So if these things are configured that way, there very well may be credentials for them to talk to the back-end authentication servers that are on the device. In theory, if you get on one of these things that's doing SSL VPN, you could also get access to VPN session data. You could see what people are doing. That's a fairly advanced attack, but it's still not outside the realm of possibility. And like I said, they have access to all your load balanced servers. One of the common uses for these devices is SSL offloading. So you put your SSL or your TLS certificates on a virtual IP on the device, and then you speak clear text HTTP to your backend servers. So if you're doing something like any sort of sensitive information, it's encrypted across the internet to your users, but it may not be encrypted when it's talking to the actual backend servers, which makes that a very juicy target, if you will. If you're running these things as DNS load balancers, you could, in theory, get in there and start tweaking around and messing with DNS responses that your target is sending out to their clients. So you may be able to reroute them to malicious server under some attacker's control. Oh, and they also make very nice, expensive beer taps. This picture is from an unnamed organization who was decommissioning some of their I think $1.5 million F5s, and they decided to encase it in ice and run a beer tap through it for a Christmas party. It was quite a thing to see. So let's go a little bit into the internal architecture, because these are not your normal Linux devices, obviously. They run something called the traffic management microkernel, which is what handles what they call the serving plane. So this is where all of your load balancing traffic happens. This is where all of this is where the selling point of these things. And this code is entirely proprietary. It's not open sourced at all. Then they run CentOS, which is their host management subsystem. And this is where the fun happens, right? So this is regular Linux. It's been a little bit tweaked by the vendor, but all of their management plane stuff happens over here on the Linux side of the world. And then if you can see in this diagram, they also have an always-on management, which we're not going to really talk about today because there was nothing interesting there. What's interesting is that they don't have a secure boot, and they also don't have any way of validating that the firmware that's on the FPGAs or the devices themselves hasn't been tampered with. We kind of went down that route during one of the investigations to see if, we knew an attacker was on a device. Could they have put a backdoor on the firmware? Could they have modified something with the boot system? The response we got was that, well, it would be really difficult to do, and unfortunately, that would require special tooling that was not available to customers to verify. They also don't have any sort of endpoint security. So if you're running something like CrowdStrike or Carbon Black or one of these other products, I wasn't able to find any endpoint clients that would run on one of these network devices, which seems like a bit of a gap because they do run Linux. So in theory, you could be running, if you have an endpoint product that runs on a Linux server, in theory, you could be running something similar on one of these devices and have better visibility into what's going on with them. They have an API. They actually have their main API is called iControl. It runs, I don't remember what the original iControl ran across, but they've implemented a REST version of it in the last few years. And then they have some shells, right? So the GUI, as I mentioned, is running Apache Tomcat, and then you can, of course, SSH into them. Interestingly, they call Bash, the 25-year-old shell that we all know and love, that is considered the advanced shell. They have TMSH, which is, I believe, Traffic Management Shell is what the acronym is for. That's their own proprietary shell. It gives the sort of tab completion and context-sensitive help that we're all used to when using Cisco or Juniper or any of those other vendors. They also implemented this thing as a JSP. But what's interesting is, as I was researching this, I wasn't able to find any documentation about this JSP implementation of the shell. Like their developer site had nothing. Their support site had nothing. So somebody along the lines decided we should make this shell workable over the internet via a browser. But I couldn't find any reason why or documentation as to what the point of this thing was. So let's kind of go into the vulnerability here. The vulnerability was stated as the traffic management interface had a RCE vulnerability on undisclosed pages. That's a long way of saying this is a path traversal vulnerability against the management GUI. The POC for this thing quite literally would fit in a tweet, and it works either from curl, it works in a web browser. This is just a sort of sample of one of the early POCs that we discovered people using. The question mark command equals anything. That command, well, technically has to be a TMSH, like properly formatted command, but whatever you put in there, it's going to run in the context as though it's an authenticated administrative user. Now, F5 does advise to never expose the management interface of these devices to the internet. The same guidance you'd hear from anyone with a web management, but it turns out about 10,000 people decided to not listen to that advice and leave these management interfaces dangling off the internet. Now, one of the interesting things about them is they run both a hardware version, which is the appliances that you buy and install in your racks, sort of the data centers we've always known and loved. And now with clouds becoming a big thing, they've released a virtual version. The virtual version, just due to the way that cloud architecture runs, is not going to have a dedicated NIC for management and then dedicated NICs for traffic handling. So I suspect that a large amount of these management interfaces on the internet were probably because, people spun up a cloud VM, they had to get to it. Maybe they left it exposed afterwards. We'll never really know for sure. They had an interesting approach to patching and mitigations on this. So when the advisory came out on June 30th, they initially had a workaround to block the attack until you were able to patch the thing. This was a location match statement in Apache that was designed to prevent this weird ../path from being injected. Now, somebody managed to bypass their initial mitigation in around 24 hours. They then released a update to the mitigation, which was to also block HSQLDB from being included in a web path. They retracted that mitigation the next day and said that all the mitigations were determined to be ineffective. And then a day later, they reversed course yet again and said that no, these mitigations are actually effective. So it kind of left those of us trying to fix this issue a bit confused for the first week when exploitation was happening fairly rapidly. There was no advance notice to customers that we've been able to tell. Everyone I've spoken to that uses F5 in their networks and has very expensive support contracts told me that they didn't hear anything about this until the vulnerability was posted up on their site. The really interesting part about this is that they didn't coordinate their patching. So if we look at the top box there, you can see which versions are vulnerable, and it tells you which versions the fixes were introduced in. Now, if you look down at the lower part of the slide, you can see that they sort of staggered the releases of patches that had the fix. The earliest one being version 14.1.2.6, which was released on June 10th. And then, they kind of staggered the releases out for the next remaining, about 3 weeks of the month. The IOC tool that they released didn't come out until 3 weeks after the patches had already been released and after widescale compromise had happened pretty extensively. So it felt like a little bit too little, too late, but we'll get more into that later. So the interesting thing about this vulnerability is it's not a super elite ODE. It's not somebody who just figured out a technique that nobody had ever tried before. The full researcher blog from PT Security, that link is right there at the top. And this gentleman, Mikhail, he actually is the same gentleman who found CVE 2020-5902, which was the remote code execution vulnerability against Citrix's platform. That came out back in December of 2019. I've actually spoken about that at different conferences. What's crazy about his blog is if you dig through it, you realize that he's pointing to some research from Orange Psi from Black Hat 2018 called Breaking Parser Logic. And the screenshot here is a slide taken from Orange's Black Hat slides. So you can actually see quite literally the exact ../path that he talked about in 2018 was applicable to the F5 devices. And he disclosed this 20 months, the Orange disclosed this type of technique 20 months before Mikhail found and reported this bug to the vendor. And this was also 5 months after he had found and disclosed almost the same bug to Citrix. And the interesting thing with this, in reading his blog, is I noticed he didn't actually find that tmsh.jsp POC that I had a couple slides earlier. What he went after was the HSQLDB attack vector. What's interesting is that that was the one that they had to add later to their advisory. The initial advisory had nothing about the HSQLDB attack vector, so there was no way to mitigate or block it at first. So the question is, if he didn't find it, who did? And I have been working this for, a month and a half at this point. I don't know that we'll ever figure out who found that TMSH command POC. So the hunting techniques, right? Initially, when this came out in the end of June, obviously I kind of have this thing about going and hunting Shodan and trying to find systems of exposure of vulnerabilities and trying to narrow down the billions of IP addresses to the ones that we actually need to go and try to protect. So initially they just said, hey, we found more than 8,000 vulnerable devices across that are hooked up to the internet. And I had a whole bunch of F5 related Shodan dorks that I've been collecting, and I have a GitHub where I store all this stuff. So I've been collecting these for a while, but I didn't have one for their management interfaces, and which was interesting. And fortunately, one of the CTI League members, he actually has one in his lab. So probably June 30th or July 1st, July 2nd, we were talking back and forth, and he was nice enough to go and hit one with curl. And all I needed to figure out was, what does this thing look like when an unauthenticated system talks to it, which was fairly easy to find. And it turns out that the query to find these things doesn't require any advanced licenses for Shodan. It's as simple as an http.title query And if you're interested more in that methodology, the YouTube link is the talk that I did at Blue Hat Israel back in February of 2020, when we could still travel before the whole world got sent to timeout for not washing our hands. And so once we figured out what the query looked like, there was 8,640 devices on July 2nd that had been exposed. So that pretty much lined up with the blog, and we figured, okay, we have the right, this is the correct way to find these things. And it was easy enough to test by clicking through one of the links, and you can see the management interface of the device pop up. And you're like, all right, we're golden here. So as I said, I started off working a lot of this with other members of the CTI League, and our kind of playbook when these things happen is we use Shodan access. I should mention that John Matherly from Shodan was gracious enough to donate a API key to the League back in March when we first started it up. So we have the ability to do some advanced searching and downloading in our mission to defect the mission critical healthcare sector. So we pull all of the systems for that query out of the internet, or from the internet out of Shodan. We parse out IPs, autonomous systems, device host names, SSL certificate details. Really what we're trying to do is figure out, of these ones that are exposed, can we narrow down the ones that are running on some sort of a healthcare medical hospital network, because we have members who we can reach out to and say, hey, here's a list of hospitals with devices that are vulnerable. Can you go ring the alarm bells and ruin some people's 4th of July weekends? Most of us are actually, there was a core group of us, about maybe 6 or 7, that we worked quite literally through the entire 4th of July weekend, which for those of us in America was a holiday weekend. And we spent it probably blowing up people's phones when they were at a barbecue, like letting them know, hey, you got to go fix a network device, instead of, shooting off some fireworks and drinking some beer. We did manage to notify dozens of health organizations. Quite a few Fortune 500s who barely just went through all of our Rolodexes and said, hey, who do we know? How can we reach out and get the ball rolling? Because we knew from historically looking at Citrix and the way that all of that stuff played out in early January, also with Pulse VPN, the way that played out back in 2019 and continues to, that minutes and hours count when we're talking about defending networks from this type of a threat. Some special thanks here. A list of folks that are CTI League members. They worked through the weekend with me, where I should say we all just worked through the weekend together. So thank you very much. I'm sure there's a bunch of hospitals who would like to thank you, but it's hard to quantify things that don't happen, right? And of course, definitely thank you from the fine folks at NCC Group, who were there, very cooperative, collaborated with me mostly as I was asking for details and sharing hunting tips. We would not have been able to respond to this as quickly as we had without their collaboration. So what did the attack timeline look like? So June 30th is when this vulnerability came out, when it was announced. Like I said, July 2nd is when David Krause from the CTI League and I figured out how to hunt these things down on Shodan. On July 4th in the morning, I noticed a tweet from Rich Warren from NCC Group where he was saying, hey, I'm seeing my honeypots picking up activity. What this looks like the F5 vulnerability. So what I did is just shoot him a DM on Twitter and said, hey man, would you be willing to share this with me? We're trying to figure out how to track down what this attack looks like. And if you ask nicely, good things happen. So he was happy to share what he was seeing. And I was able to use that to then go and talk to Andrew over at Grey Noise and John over at Shodan and say, hey guys, can you implement for Shodan, can you implement a test that goes out and, can non-invasively figure out if these things are vulnerable? And then Grey Noise, on the sort of other side of that coin, here's what a scan and attack pattern looks like. So you can start picking up IP addresses that are, trying to programmatically just exploit this, or I should say non-discriminately exploit this type of thing. Unfortunately, after working for, almost 3 days straight, on the morning of July 5th, someone pointed out that the full POC had been added to a certain hacking framework that everybody likes. Which was a little frustrating, I'm not going to lie, when we had all spent our weekend trying to defend people, and then it kind of got trumped by putting, the attack payload into something on a Sunday when, all of the network administrators and security folks are probably still recovering from, celebrating that weekend. So it's just, the timing was a little uncool. And then, as expected, that same day, everybody started seeing widescale compromise. And when I say seeing, I wouldn't say that we saw it on that Sunday, but as we started going through the logs of different devices on Monday and Tuesday, we were seeing indications of compromise pretty much starting hours after that POC had been put out there. It didn't take very long. And then, as I mentioned, 3 weeks after the vulnerability was disclosed, F5 published a script to help just figure out if your device had been compromised. Of course, if you'd had this thing exposed and vulnerable, you were pretty much 100% certain that your device had been compromised at that point. So what did we find as we were digging through and figuring out, like, what do these attack timelines look like? What does a device look like after it's been compromised? Well, we found kind of your standard. We found web shells. We found Monero miners. We found a couple systems that had a puppy rat, which if anybody pays attention to different rats, that one's popular with the Iranians. And also what was fun was we found some Python-based port scanners and different lateral movement tools, usually things involving like SMB, going after Windows servers, because the devices do run a full-fledged version of Linux, but they're not going to have any sort of hacking tools on them. I don't believe that they have compilers on them, and that's not something most people will do, is compile a tool. So they were bringing their port scanners and their, SMB version, like, trying to either use MS-1710 or some of these other stuff they were trying to go after the servers on the back end with. The thing that I found really interesting was as we dug through some of these payloads, and a lot of these were coming in as base64 encoded, so we were getting the entire payload out of a web server log. There's two things that kind of stuck out to me that indicated the people that did this, that were doing this, had a little bit better knowledge than your average sort of Linux script kiddie, right? Who's just going to go and they're going to use your off-the-shelf hacking tool. They're going to just go with the tricks that they've always used. The first one was they knew enough to remount one of the file systems on the device. Now, the F5s are kind of different than your standard Linux in that they mount the /user file system as read-only, and there's actually a solution document on their support site that says, hey, we do this as a security measure to keep people from, writing to /user. Well, these attackers, their first lines of their payloads would be mount -o, rewrite, remount. So they would change the user system to be rewritable file system. They would drop things that were usually PHP-based web shells or other, basically reverse shells. They would drop it into user, and then they would remount it back to read-only, so it didn't look like anything had changed on the device. They also started digging through. They would try to use the Linux cat command to grab the config, big IP, kstore master file, which is what's called the Secure Vault device key. So this is a very specific to an F5 thing. This device key is used to encrypt and decrypt credentials that are stored in the Secure Vault component of their product. So in theory, with one of these keys, if you had downloaded a config archive that had, SSL, if you had SSL passwords that had to be entered before the cert was loaded, those would be in there. Device passwords. It's everything that was supposed to be secured by Secure Vault. You could pretty much get through. You could unsecure it if you had the device key, and probably some other advanced hackery. The other thing we saw was that they started going after this REST API. Now, the mitigations that they gave were designed to block the malformed web requests to the management GUI using this ... some ASCII encoded variations, or trying to access the HSQL DB path. What we saw was attackers would get in, they would use one of the standard payloads, they would create an account on the device, an administrative user account, and then they would come back and they would use the REST API because they fully implemented all of the TMSH commands via the REST API. So they didn't need to use the exploit anymore. And if you had mitigations applied, remember these mitigations aren't designed to block every access to the management interface. It's only designed to block malicious access. So REST API is normal device management, and it continued to work. So as a advice to somebody who's doing incident response on one of these things, you want to make sure you're looking at how many users you expect to have on your device and how many users actually exist. Because if they've created a user account that's legit, they may be abusing it using the REST API, and it will look exactly like administrative traffic. And then the definitive list of IOC stuff here is at the bottom. NCC Group was updating that blog almost every day, every couple days. I don't have time in this talk to go through all of the really cool stuff that they did, but I really recommend, if you're interested more, check out this link. and go read. They have like dozens of different IOCs and different patterns that they saw. What I'm mostly talking about is the ones that I was directly involved with. So some closing thoughts on this. Security is hard. And we all say this and we all know this, but this is one of those items or one of those vulnerabilities that really I feel like could have probably been either avoided entirely or mitigated a lot better, or just the response could have been a little bit better. The thing I found really frustrating was that this wasn't, as I said, a brand new technique. It was not something that nobody had ever seen. This was something that, had they sent someone to Black Hat in 2018, they may have been able to say, hey, we use this type of stuff in our product. Maybe we should go check and see if, these types of, path traversal attacks are something that we need to worry about. At the very least, when their biggest competitor, Citrix, was popped with this type of thing back in December, I would somewhat expect at least someone to say, hey, let's go see if this code pattern exists in our product, because our products do the same things or very similar things. We have very similar, like every aspect of these things is it's not identical, but they're very close, right? And at that point, somebody should have said, hey, it happened to them. Could it happen to us? Let's go take a look. That obviously didn't happen. The other thing is, I think people get into this habit of assuming, well, I paid, $100,000 for this piece of equipment. It must have better security than the cheap one. F5's got a competitor that they undercut them quite drastically, and usually the stance is that, well, when the money buys you more things, it doesn't. They all do the same thing. And black box systems built on open source software are going to have IoT grade flaws, right? We see this with everything from your smart house light bulbs to, your cameras to everything else. There's always these little oversights because there is, I believe, still somewhat of an assumption that, open source is more secure because everybody can look at the code. Well, that only really matters if someone who knows security and is looking at the code and understands when a vulnerability is there. And if they don't know how to see it, they don't know how to fix it. So the other part about this is know your network, your exposure, and your risk. As I mentioned, F5 does tell you don't put the management interface for these things on the internet. I think we all understand don't put the management interface for any piece of critical information or infrastructure on the internet. But people still do it. And then we also find is that people are surprised to find out that this stuff is on the internet. So you need to be keeping tabs on what you have connected, what's out there, what's public. And you can, like I said, the Blue Hat talk I talk a lot about how to do this yourself. It doesn't take long. It takes maybe 10 minutes once every couple of weeks, and you'll know, did anything new pop out there? And then, because it's COVID season, I like to say wear a mask, right? Put ACLs on everything. One of the mitigations that an individual or a group that I worked with used was to put ACLs on the HTTPD process of Apache itself. Now, if done correctly, this won't even allow someone to talk to the web interface. So you could be unmitigated, unpatched, but if you put ACLs on your Apache process, nobody would be able to get to you in the first place, and now you have at least some breathing room with your patching cadence. Social distance, network isolation, right? These devices get plugged in, and then generally there's let's just open up all ports, all protocols to every other part of the network, because it's easier than trying to, define exactly what a policy needs to look like at your switch layer of which networks can talk to which and which VLANs can crosstalk. I know it takes a lot longer to do it that way, but it will save you, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, as they say. And then I like to say, wash your hands. So apply patches. Apply them as soon as you can. As I mentioned, these devices have a bit of a history of some of their patches causing unintended behavior. There can be stability issues, but it's a good overall message. In this instance, though, it may, if you were running one of the versions that didn't receive a patch until right when the advisory came out, you would have been in a harder spot than someone who was running the version 14, where they had 3 weeks to, install the patch. But that kind of brings me to another point, and I'll close here, is that when you're a network vendor, when you're a vendor for this type of category of infrastructure, it behooves you to give out advance notice to your customers, right? Dropping the patches with fixes 3 weeks before you tell anybody how important that patch is with that fix, it's not a great look, right? These things take time, change windows, change control. We're in the middle of a pandemic. Everybody's working harder with less. So having a vulnerability of this scale just sort of announced and it's like, all right, here's the patches. There was a better way that could have been handled. And also having some folks that really tested through all of the mitigations. This is a high severity. This is a CVSS 10.0, right? This is as bad as it gets. And at some levels of the mitigation felt like it was a little bit phoned in, right? When you're having to update your workaround, when you're having to, keep changing what you're telling your customers to do, it doesn't instill a great sense of confidence in the information that's being provided. So with that, I will say thank you very much, Disclosure. Enjoy the rest of the conference, and please stay safe.